So Jonah chapter 1, verses 1 through 16, it says, "Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai, saying, Arise and go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me." But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. That's a hard word to say, by the way. He went down to Joppa, and he found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare. He went down into it to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. And then the mariners were afraid, and each cried out to his God. And they hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. But Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship, and had laid down and was fast asleep. So the captain came and said to him, "What do you mean, you sleeper? Arise and call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give thought to us, that we may not perish." And they said to one another, "Come, let us cast lots, that we may know on whose account this evil has come upon us." And so they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. And then they said to him, "Tell us, on whose account has this evil come upon us? What is your occupation? Where do you come from? What is your country? And of what people are you?" And he said to them, "I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." And the men were exceedingly afraid, and they said to him, "What is this that you have done?" For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord, because he had told them. Then they said to him, "What shall we do to you to make the sea quiet down for us?" For the sea grew more and more tempestuous. And he said to them, "Pick me up and hurl me into the sea. The sea will quiet down for you. For I know that it is because of me that this great tempest has come upon you." Nevertheless, the men rowed hard and to get back to dry land, but they could not, for the sea grew more and more tempestuous against them. Therefore they called out to the Lord, "O Lord, let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not on us innocent blood. For you, O Lord, have done as it has pleased you." So they picked up Jonah, and they hurled him into the sea, and the sea ceased its raging. And the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord, and they made vows. Now Jonah, I tell you, Jonah's a story that many of us are familiar with, particularly if you grew up in church. I remember sitting in a giant, big fish made out of black trash bags at Vacation Bible School when I was a little kid. And I thought it was fun. I'm like, man, I'd like to be like Jonah. I'd like to live in the belly of a big fish. Because I said in the belly of a whale, and I got about a 20-minute lecture of how it wasn't a whale, by the way. But I laughed at the thought of this man being swallowed up by this giant fish and then being vomited out. That was funny to my little 8-year-old mind. I had all kinds of jokes, I'm sure, running through my mind that my 47-year-old mind is still trying to filter. The problem is that too often we see Jonah as a kid's story. We see it as a fishtale. And there's some people that still debate it today. There are a growing number of scholars that say that there's no way this could possibly be a true story. Maybe it's just a story that's passed down, a mythological story that's passed down with a theological lesson. But you know, Jesus didn't seem to think that. When they asked for a sign from Jesus, one of the signs that he said is that as Jonah, this is in Matthew 12:40, it says, "For as Jonah spent 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a great fish, so will the Son of Man spend 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." By saying just as Jonah, he seems to imply that Jonah was a real man, and that Jonah, that Jonah was a real man, and that the fish was real. And so, and if Jesus was going to use a mythological analogy to talk about his death and his resurrection, then people would assume that he is speaking as a metaphor and not as something real. So for those reasons, I'm going to approach the book of Jonah as though it were a historical account. When we imagine a book of Jonah, most of us probably think immediately of his run-in with the big old fish. Because that's what we talk about the most. When I say Jonah, most people think of, oh yeah, that guy that got swallowed up by a big fish. Poor little guy, bless his heart. All those kind of things come to our mind. But since Jonah's time in the fish's belly takes up a small portion of the story, I wonder if we fixate on it so much that we miss a lot that's really important from this book. It says at the very first verse there, now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Now by the time we get to this story, by the time we get to Jonah has already answered a prophetic call. Jonah has already been preaching in Israel. In fact, we find out in 2 Kings chapter 14 that through Jonah's preaching, Jeroboam II expanded Israel's borders. The borders that had been weakened by Assyria. And as a result, Israel was not blotted out as a people. So Jonah was kind of a hero to a lot of people. You see, Assyria was powerful and brutal, and they used force and any means necessary to assert their dominance. And God told Jonah to prophesy that the borders of Israel would expand. And people love that. So when we read the word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai, if we were reading this for the very first time, the people would be excited, thinking we're about to get some really good news. But then, verse 2. Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me. Whoa, wait, Nineveh? Now the good news that they were expecting to hear is all of a sudden not so good. Nineveh. Nineveh is the capital of Assyria. Assyria's history dates back to at least the 14th century BC. At the time of Jonah, it's about the 8th century BC, when Jonah's prophesying. And that was the time when Assyria, the empire, experienced great strength and expansion. Assyria is located in northern Mesopotamia, in the area that's now known as northern Iraq and southeastern Turkey. The city of Nineveh would be most likely modern-day Mosul, Iraq. And it's set on the eastern bank of the Tigris River, which was 500 miles northeast of Israel. And Nineveh was known as a royal and luxurious city. It had things like public squares and parks, a zoo, and libraries. But they were also famous for their brutal attacks on others. You see, as an empire, Assyria was a vile and vicious people. And as they expanded to conquer other nations, they would use great brutality, killing and enslaving without mercy. They were famously cruel and fearsome. And Jonah is told, go to Nineveh. Now this prophet, Jonah, has had some ministry success in the past. He's walked with the Lord. He knows that the Lord is good. He knows that God does what he says he's going to do. He spent a good portion of his life following God. He's experienced the kindness of God. He knows that God's power is a power that can comfort, a power that can heal, a power that can judge, and a power that can save. Jonah knows the call. He's followed the call in the past. But now he's going to this, instead of going to the people of Israel who had some understanding of who God is, he's told to go to a Gentile pagan nation who has no knowledge of God. Assyria, The wicked people of Nineveh, enemies of Israel. Well, what happens? Verse 3 says, and Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare. By the way, paid the fare, that's an understatement right there. He paid the fare and he went down into it to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. Twice in verse 3 it says he was trying to flee the presence of the Lord. That phrase, fleeing the presence of the Lord, is a Hebrew idiom that indicates that Jonah is now in full rebellion. And he's not just rebelling, he seems to be actively trying to ditch God. You know, like whenever you go to Walmart and there's that person that you know, okay, I got to get this one thing, and if I talk to them, I'm gonna have to spend about 45 minutes telling them about my day and my kids and reminding them of my kids' names, like that kind of thing. Where you try to, oh man, they went to the grocery department. I think I need something over in automotive. Jonah's trying to do that with God. You see, Tarshish is the farthest place away from the known Mediterranean world at the time. And that's where Jonah's trying to go. In fact, Isaiah 66, verse 19 tells us a little bit about Tarshish. It says, I will set up a sign among them, and from them I will send survivors to the nations, to Tarshish, Pul and Lud, and who draw the bow, I don't know these names, to Tabal and Javan, to the coastlands far away, that have not heard my fame or seen my glory, and they shall declare my glory among the nations. You see, Tarshish was a place that didn't know God, that hadn't seen his glory, that hadn't heard from him. And it seems that Jonah doesn't want to see or hear from God anymore. Why? Well, we're not going to find out until chapter 4. And I think God's probably intentional about that. Because maybe it gives us time to pause and say, why do you and I disobey God sometimes? Why do we ignore his call? Do we have trust issues with God? Do we think we know better than he does? We ask all these questions like, if God is so loving, then why? Yeah. Or do we just not like his word? Jonah was ready to give up on God, but God hadn't given up on Jonah. You see, God could have sent anybody. Jonah didn't want to go. Like, okay, I'm done with you. Let me send the next prophet. But he still goes after Jonah. Verse 4, but the Lord. That tells us that now God's getting involved. Beginning in verse 4, the story's going to take a turn. Jonah's running away, but God doesn't let Jonah get far before he intervenes in a dramatic way. I wonder if God's ever intervened in a dramatic way in your life. Gotten your attention in some way you didn't want him to get your attention, but he got it. God sent a storm that affects Jonah. And not just Jonah, but all those who were with him. Even these mariners were afraid, terrified, horrified. And they were known as people of the sea. They'd seen storms before, but they knew that there was something supernatural about this one. Something different about this storm. And it says, but Jonah, verse 5, had gone down into the inner part of the ship and lay down and was fast asleep. This is the third time in just a few short verses that it mentions Jonah going down. Twice in verse 3 and here in verse 5. You see, physically and spiritually, Jonah is going down. In contrast with the ship's crew, who are up at the top, who are crying out to their gods, who are trying their best to save lives, Jonah descended into the bowels of the ship and falls into this apathetic sleep without a care in the world. He's hiding from God, in effect, plugging his ears to the voice of the Lord. It's almost as if he's got his fingers over his ears going, I can't hear you. That's what he's doing to God. He didn't want to listen. He doesn't want to obey. And the captain comes looking for Jonah. He says, what do you mean, you sleeper? Which if I were to translate that from the original language, I would say, dude, what are you thinking? Like, wake up, get up. What are you doing? Why are you sleeping? Get up. Don't you know we're all about to die? Do you see the irony here? Jonah's running away from God, and the captain of the ship is seeking God. God is going to get Jonah's attention. God is prepared to break up the ship, to drown Jonah, and to let all those idol-worshiping sailors die, all in response to Jonah's rebellious action. William Banks writes this. He says, rebellion never escapes God's notice. It is foolish for men to think that they can resist God's will with impunity. The Lord may let a man go to a certain point before he steps in, but when he does move, he moves with no uncertainty. This was no minor storm. These are seasoned people of the sea, scared for their lives, and they're hurling out the cargo. Like it says that they are hurling the cargo, while God is hurling a great wind. And look, you can't out-hurl God. All right, it's just not going to win that one. You see, God doesn't want their cargo. He wants the heart. He wants obedience from his child, the prophet. Jonah is rebelling, actively rebelling. And to rebel is to invite God's wrath. They ask Jonah, tell us, on whose account has this evil come? Verse 8. What's your occupation? Where do you come from? What's your country? Of what people are you? Who are you, Jonah? And this is the first time we have Jonah speaking in the text. I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord. Makes you kind of wonder, doesn't it? I'm a Hebrew, and I fear the... do you really fear the Lord? Or is it lip service? Did you once fear him? Because you're not acting like you fear him right now. And learning that Jonah had sinned against God, the God who made the sea, the men on this ship were seized by a great fear. You're going to see that word, great. It's megas in the original. You're going to see that word a lot in the story of Jonah. Go to that great city. There was a great storm. There was great fear. There was a great calm. Go to that great city. You'll hear that word over and over in the story of Jonah. You see, it was the mariners that feared the Lord. Jonah said it, but his actions didn't seem to be justifying it. But theirs did. They began urgently seeking a way to appease Jonah's God. They're learning the hard way that sin and a lack of repentance has dire consequences. You see, in this exchange, we see God using Jonah to spread his word to all nations. He really is. He wanted them to go to the nation of Assyria. Jonah's like, man, I'm not doing that. I'm not going to those Gentile, pagan, wicked people. And he gets on a boat with pagan, Gentile people. And God turns their heart toward him through the actions or inaction of Jonah. God's using Jonah to spread his word, even in Jonah's reluctance. These sailors are witnessing the power of God. But God's also working on Jonah's heart And I love it because that's one of the beauties that you see here from this story. That, I mean, we're just halfway through chapter 1, and we see that God is already concerned. He's concerned about the redemption of whole people groups. He's concerned about the hearts of nations, but he still has this love and this concern for the individual Jonah. And that's beautiful to me. Because let me tell you, sometimes I can get caught up in God's heart for this people group, or God's heart for this country, or God's heart for this neighborhood. And somehow I'll miss that God has a heart for me too. And maybe you've experienced that as well. But these men, they're crying out for mercy, something Jonah has not done yet. They are praying, something Jonah has not done yet. At least it's not recorded. And they're like, what do we do? And he says, just throw me overboard. And in a way, that sounds very noble. Throw me overboard and you all will be saved. But there's a part of me that wonders, is Jonah being noble? Or is he saying, if they throw me overboard and I die, I don't have to go to Nineveh? Makes you wonder. Jonah, perhaps he thought he was running to some distant exotic land where he didn't have to listen to God anymore. And at this moment, it appears that he's running to his death. They're about to throw him over. That's where sin leads us. It disorients us. It deceives us. It leads us to places that we don't want to go. Rebellion against God never ends in our good. Sin always leads to a downward path. See, in these acts of worship, these sailors are identifying themselves as followers of God. So even as Jonah disobeyed God and his command to go to a foreign nation, God's using him to lead these sailors from foreign nations. I love how God does that. He's going to work it out. Jonah claimed faith. I believe in God. I fear God. I'm a Hebrew. But at this moment, it's the sailors who are showing they fear God in their worship. We see two pictures. We see a shockingly disobedient Israelite prophet. I'll get it out. Israelite prophet. And we see a surprisingly transformed group of Gentiles. God's intent on accomplishing his purpose and spreading his salvation to all nations. But he's also intent on transforming and caring for the hearts of his people. And we can see that in our own lives. Jonah was resolved in his effort to flee from the presence of God and to shirk the command of God that God had given him. But you see, God was committed to Jonah and the work that he planned to do in him and through him. That's good news for Jonah, and that's good news for us. Because often, we're the rebellious ones. Often, we're the ones that are going, I don't really want to do that. You want me to go where and talk to who? No, I'm good. I'm good, God. But God will spread his word to the nations, and he'll use us to do it. He's using us right now to shape the lives of others. He wants to shape our hearts into his likeness. The question for us is, are we going to resist like Jonah, or will we submit to the good work that God intends to do? I wonder, which will we choose? Now I'm going to stop there. I actually put a line in my notes that says, stop here if it's 12 o'clock. It's 12 o'clock. But let me tell you this. There was a verse in there. It said that Jonah paid the fare, and then he got on a boat. Over the years, that has become one of the funniest verses to me. Because Jonah thinks that he's just paying, some financial fee to get on a boat. But God's going to make him pay for rebelling against him. he's going to become big fish vomit. All right? All right, that's your diet plan, by the way. All right, you're welcome. God's going to do something with them. God's going to do whatever it takes to get the heart of his prophet and turn it back toward him. Jonah's resistant. Who? I almost hesitate to ask this question. Who do you hate so much that you'd rather die than to see God turn their heart around? That's what's going on in Jonah. Listen, there's two people that Jesus talks about in the Bible. Our neighbors that we're called to love, and our enemies that we're called to love. That's it. Love your neighbor, love your enemy, most of all, love God. And if you love God, you can't hate your enemy. Jonah's got some bitterness and some hatred in his heart. He's got such a hatred for Assyria, for the people of Nineveh in particular, that he's hurting himself. And he's putting other lives in danger over his resistance to follow God's lead. We live in a time where it's easy to find enemies. We really do. It wasn't very long ago that we used to actually talk to people face to face. And then we'd have to determine if you were my enemy or not. Now all we have to do is type on a keyboard. And we get a little bold with it, or a little dumb with it. And all of a sudden we create all of these enemies. We find all these reasons why we're not supposed to like this person or that person because maybe they believe different than I do. Or maybe they vote different than I do. And we create all these enemies. When God's saying, will you just go to the people I tell you to go to and share my message? Are we willing to do that? Are we willing to let God work in our heart to mold us, to transform us, and to make us into the people he wants us to be? How's your heart? Are you open? Are you listening? That's my prayer for us. That we're open to the heart, the very heart of God. We're gonna look. This was a tough lesson on Jonah. I get it, but we're gonna look at Jonah for the next couple of weeks. I don't know how many, till God says it's over, and we're gonna do kind of a deep dive into Jonah to see that it's more than just a fishtail. There's a lesson in there for all of us, for all people. I know sometimes I used to always hear it in the context of boy, if God's calling you to preach, you better not ignore that call, right? But I think it's a lot deeper than that. A lot deeper than that. That was just somebody that didn't want to preach on a Sunday and asked me to do it for them. It's a lot deeper than that. God wants to see all men come to him. He wants to see hearts committed to him. So let us start with us.